Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for inviting me here tonight. In 1991, I traveled to the Habur River, as Aram has just said, south of Comishli. No mic working? It started. Every time I get in an elevator when I'm going to give a lecture, it stops. Taxis in London break down. It's my hatred of technology, and it always happens. We're away. Anyway, in 1991, I traveled to the Habur River, south of Comishli in Syria, because I knew an exact location where were the bones of genocide, Armenian genocide victims. And they were supposed to be on a riverbed, but we couldn't find the river. I was finding dogs' bones, cats' bones, wild animals. But eventually, my French photographer, who was at the top of a hill, said, "Robert, the river moved. It's here." And there had been a rainstorm washing away a crevasse in the side of the hill. And there in the crevasse were skeletons like this. They were your ancestors. And I was with an Armenian family. A Syrian policeman turned up and said, "It's okay, they're not yours." And I was with an Armenian family, and we took some of the bones out of the mud, those that seemed to be whole, and they were put into the Armenian Memorial Church at Deir ez-Zor. And 2 years ago, when Nusra entered Deir ez-Zor, they took the bones, as well as other Armenian victims' bones, out of the crypt and threw them on the road to be driven over by cars, and then they blew up the church. Bones are real. You know, when I hear this endless, the Armenians make the biggest lie in the First World War in the last century, but the bones are real. I still see them when I'm on the Syrian front line. They're scattered over hills, and there are bits of skulls, and they are your Armenian dead bodies from the genocide. And I think there's a frightening parallel between the genociders of 1915 and the cult of ISIS. Here's a news story from February 2014, not by me. Bishop Elias Toume, representative of the Greek Orthodox Patriarch of Antioch and all the East, tells of the funeral he led 10 days ago for the headless body of one of his parishioners in Marmarita. The Reverend Adib Awad, vice moderator of the National Evangelical Synod of Syria and Lebanon, explains how the rebels blew up his church and then pointed the finger at the regime. Bishop Armash Nalbandian, primate of the Armenian Church of Damascus, I know him quite well, says he received word on Facebook from a fellow bishop in Aleppo that 2 congregants were traveling when opposition fighters stopped their bus, made them present their Armenian IDs, and took them away. The fighters, Nalbandian recounts, returned to the fellow passengers on the bus a few hours later with a box, which, they said, contained cakes, and inside, of course, were the 2 Armenian heads. I have myself watched the oceans of refugees floating over the deserts, Yazidis fleeing from Nineveh, Armenians from Aleppo again, Sunnis fleeing Shiites. Let me take you back to 1915 again. And here I'm indebted to Peter Balakian. In the autumn of 1915, an Austrian engineer called Litzmeier, who was helping build the Constantinople-Baghdad railway across Turkey, saw what he thought was a large army slowly moving towards him from the north. In the words of his contemporary, Bishop Grigoris Balakian, Litzmeier, quote, thought it was a Turkish army heading for Mesopotamia, where at that time the British, having taken Basra, were trying to capture Baghdad. As the crowd came closer, however, he realized that it was not an army, but a huge caravan of women moving forward under the supervision of soldiers. They numbered, according to some estimates, as many as 40,000. Subjected to constant rape and beating, some women had already swallowed poison on their way from their homes in Erzurum, Serena, Sivas, and Bitlis, and other cities in Turkish Western Armenia. Some of them, Balakian recorded, had been driven to such a state that they were mere skeletons enveloped in rags, with skin that had turned leathery, burned from the sun, cold, and wind. Many pregnant women, having become numb, had left their newborns on the side of the road as a protest against mankind and God. New evidence, however, is needed. We have so many evidence from the survivors when they spoke, when they were still alive, so much written evidence from the Armenian side. And of course we have American diplomats and NGOs, missionaries who were there at the time. But I think it's important to keep widening the evidence range, because it's one thing for Turkish nationalists to say, well, the Armenians are all the same, they lie about the genocide, it's the biggest lie. Do you think the British Army would lie? Do you think the Australian Army would lie? Do you think the New Zealand Army would lie? I don't think they would go along with a fantasy about the Armenian genocide unless it was true. So I've been digging up, just a small sample here, of British, Australian POWs from the Allied side, an Iranian writer, all of whom saw the same thing. And I think it's worth more and more broadening this evidential scale into Westerners who saw it. And the Turks cannot say that all these nations which were fighting Germany and the Ottoman Empire were making these stories up. Some of these accounts, I'm going to tell you, you may never have heard before. Here, for example, comes a reader from The Independent writing to me because I've been writing about the Armenian genocide. He said that his name was Robert Davidson, he was an Australian. He recalled how his grandfather, World War I veteran John Jock Davidson of the Australian Light Horse, was an eyewitness of the Armenian genocide. This is his letter to me. He wrote of the hundreds of Armenian carcasses outside the walls of Homs. They were men, women, and children, were all naked and had been left to rot or to be devoured by dogs, just like ISIS, by the way. The Australian Light Horsemen were appalled at the brutality done to these people. In another instance, my grandfather's company of soldiers came upon an Armenian woman and 2 children in skeletal condition. She signed to them that the Turks had cut the throats of her husband and 2 elder children. The Aussies gave them some clothing and all the rations that they could spare them, but then had to leave them behind as they continued in now more determined pursuit of the retreating Turks. Are the Turks going to suggest that Jock Davidson was lying? Long dead, of course. But that's his evidence, and it's very important to bring in more and more nationalities. Then we come to a First World War doctor, whose account of northern Persia, to which also Armenians, of course, were driven, was finally published in Edinburgh in Scotland. About 50,000, this is in quotation marks, Armenian refugees were flooding down the road. It was an amazing and tragic sight. British medical officer Alan Glenn was to write years after he saw the survivors. There were old men and women and children. Now and then we passed at the roadside a dying person or one already dead and half eaten by dogs. In Syria today, I see dogs eating bodies. We could do nothing for them. My colleague Craig told me later that he attended an old refugee in the road who, before he died, gave him a leather belt full of sovereigns, which he asked him to spend to help the refugees. Greater love hath no man. Let me go on again. Here's Astrid Agajanian, Armenian, of course, who I interviewed not long before she died. In the final years of her life, she spoke of the genocide. In 2013, she spoke to me. At a village one night, my father, who had been deported with us, came to see us. He told my mother that he thought he was being allowed to say goodbye, that he would be shot with the other men. I remember my mother told me that my father's last words were, "The only way to remember me is to look after Astrid." We never saw him again. It was a long march, and the Turks and Kurds came to carry off girls for rape. My other grandmother died along the way. So did my newly born brother, Vartkas. We had to leave him by the roadside. One day the Turks said they wanted to collect all the young children and look after them. Some women who couldn't feed their children let them go. Then my mother saw them piling the children on top of each other and setting them on fire. My mother pushed me under another pile of corpses. My mother saved me from the fire. She used to tell me afterwards that when she heard the screams of the children and saw the flames, it was as if their souls were going up to heaven. Here's the Iranian writer Mohammad Jamalzadeh traveling from Aleppo to Istanbul in 1915. Right at the beginning of our journey, we witnessed unbelievably and unspeakably shocking and extraordinary scenes. We saw numerous groups of Armenians who were being escorted by armed, mounted Turkish soldiers being driven to their death towards annihilation. At first, it was very shocking to us. However, later it became so common that we didn't look at them. Hundreds of Armenian women and men, along with their children in a miserable condition, were being driven along on foot under the blows of whips and guns, whipping them along like flocks of sheep. Austrian architect and engineer Litzmeier, remember, we do not know his first name, but he was working for the German government on the Baghdad Railway, saw that large army coming closer to him, and all women. When Sarah Aronson, who of course was Jewish, arrived in Palestine by rail from Turkey in December 1915, she was in a state of shock. Her brother was to describe how she saw the bodies of hundreds of Armenian men, women, and children lying on both sides of the railway. Dogs were observed feeding on the bodies. Here we go again. There were hundreds of bleached skeletons. Sarah's train, according to historian Scott Anderson, was besieged by thousands of starving Armenians. In the stampede, quote, dozens fell beneath the wheels of the train, much to the delight of its conductor. Because she expressed her horror at the scene, Sarah, who came, of course, from Ottoman Palestine, and as I say was Jewish, was condemned by Turkish officers on the train for her lack of patriotism. You see, these are all foreigners. These are not all Armenians. This is how you broaden that evidence out. So if you're going to say the genocide is a myth, you've got to say the British are lying, the Australians are lying, the New Zealanders are lying, the Iranians are lying, a Jewish woman from Jerusalem is lying. That's the wall you still need to build, I think. Now to the British time again. This time in 1909. We're going to go Wednesday morning, 14th of April. And here I have help from Missak on Vice Consul Major Doughty Wiley of the British Foreign Office, set off by train to the Turkish city of Adana. This, of course, was that other between genocides. Between the 19th century, 1909, this was another dry run, although bloody, for the 1915 genocide. He said he set off down to Adana, saying there was a very dangerous feeling in that town. Threats had been freely offered. There were some murders. Doughty Wiley set off by the next train, memorably adding in his dispatch to the Foreign Office in London that so little had I expected that any massacre was imminent that I took my wife with me. We can only imagine the good lady's reaction when about 2 stations from Adana we saw a dead body. The nearer we got to Adana, the more bodies there were. And while I was escorting my wife to Mr. Trapani's house, 2 or 3 more men were killed under the very noses of the Turkish guard. Doughty Wiley's dispatches over the next 4 days are a first-class account of the very start of the modern Armenian Holocaust. I got into uniform, went to the guard, and sharply recalled to the officer his duty to prevent murder. Doughty Wiley wrote this, having summoned some unwilling Ottoman soldiery to support him. Our vice-consul, he said, I paraded through the town with bugles blowing. We cleared the streets, sometimes by charging with the bayonet, and sometimes by firing over the heads of the crowd. Those were the days, ladies and gentlemen. Doughty Wiley's letters are in fact a record of heroism, for Doughty rescued numerous British subjects and protected many hundreds of Armenian refugees. He wasn't the only man to protect the Armenians in the actual genocide, although the one man I'm going to tell you about soon paid for it with his life. Take the Turks themselves. Again, Missak's research. A copy of the original Turkish pamphlet on the genocide, presented to the Versailles Peace Conference in 1919, when the Turkish state and parliament actually acknowledged the massacres. It was unearthed by Missak, whose earlier work, as you know, disclosed the existence of the Turkish orphanage in Beirut, who were Turkified. The text of the 1919 Turkish document proves beyond a shadow of doubt that the genocide happened, calling it the great crime committed, quote, at a time when the operation of war, the laws of humanity in their general acceptance were suspended. The same document sent to Versailles by the Turkish government refers contemptuously to the Committee of Union and Progress as the unionist organization and states that the guilt of the 3 pashas who ran the committee is obvious because it conceived and deliberately carried out this internal policy of extermination and robbery. So again and again and again, you have the Turks now, as well as the Iranians, the British. Let's go to the Australians again. Just a year ago came a small Australian publisher with a highly researched volume in which readers can find the testimony of Australian and other Allied prisoners who witnessed the dispossession and mass murder of the Armenians. Some were survivors of the 1915 siege and surrender of Kut al-Amara, in present-day Iraq, of course, whose death march to prisons in Anatolia matched in brutality, if not in numbers, the killing of the Armenian population. Other Australian troops were captured at Gallipoli. Several were submariners, whose vessel was seized by the Turkish Navy. They were Allied servicemen, not propagandists, and they wrote witness statements. For example, here is Lieutenant Leslie Luscombe of the Australian 14th Battalion at Gallipoli, captured by the Turks and sent to Angora province, where he saw a sad and depressing sight on a railway station platform, a considerable number of Armenian women and children huddled together, while Turkish soldiers, armed with whips, drove them into sheep trucks to transport them to some distant concentration camp. He uses those words. Just before Luscombe's arrival, the monks of the Armenian monastery in which he was to be held had doubtless been liquidated, he says. All the Australian prisoners were housed in abandoned Armenian houses. One of Luscombe's colleagues, Corporal George Kerr, was sent to work on the uncompleted German Taurus railway, mountain railway, and lodged on the upper floor of a house whose occupants included 60 miserable creatures, both Armenians and Greeks. Captain Thomas White of the Australian Flying Corps, he was a pilot, arriving under Turkish guard in Mosul, we know all about Mosul and ISIS, don't we, saw Armenian women reduced to beggary, pleading for food. He was marched to the abandoned Armenian town of Tel Armen, where, although a few Armenian women and children were still present, the men were ominously gone. After climbing a low hill, he found 36 newly made graves, which spoke, he said, eloquently of what had become of the Armenian men. White described himself as horrified at the Turks' handiwork, noting later that these massacres had been simultaneous and to order throughout the entire country. He got it right. At this time, the Armenians of Ras Alaim were being prepared for their death march to Deir ez-Zor, and White wrote of seeing a large camp of Armenians herded together after the general roundup from their homes and waiting to be sent on marches that had always the same ending. After a train ride to Afyon, White and others were housed in a church from which Armenian survivors had been driven. Their menfolk had been killed and furniture confiscated, and, quote, now they were being turned into the street from their last possible sanctuary. White found a burial ground of Armenians, some of whose bodies were so close to the surface that their bones protruded. On the British-Australian Indian prisoners' 2,000-kilometre death march towards Anatolia from Kut, 2 POWs discovered a well at the back of a village filled with the mutilated remains of murdered Armenian women and children. And the Armenian massacres continued, of course, into 1918 in the east of Turkey, where, to the credit of these books' authors, they also, I have to say, record the slaughter of Muslim villagers by Armenians. But in the north of Mesopotamia, Colonel Stanley Savage, an Australian Gallipoli veteran, and his men found themselves fighting 10-1 against Turkish and Kurdish cavalry, killing the stragglers from an Armenian refugee column. This is almost out of a movie. They had found them, the Australians and the New Zealanders, old men, weak and wounded women, deserted infants, and crippled children. And under fire, they pulled women and children onto their horses, leaving, of course, with aching hearts, cripples and infants to their fate. Captain Robert Nicholl, a New Zealander, was killed as he fought for the Armenians' lives. So here you see is a different kind of focus. You can't keep doing the same stories. This is the stuff of not Hollywood, but real films. And who here has ever heard of Captain Robert Nicholl? No, none of you. I mean, I have a suggestion. His anniversary of his death falls next year. This is 1980. It's always nice for journalists to get prizes, but why don't you try to find the descendants of that brave captain who died trying to defend your people and give them an award for what their ancestor did? Robert Nicholl, New Zealand, it must be easy to find him in the archives in Auckland. It's an idea. I'm trying to open up new ideas because I tell you, I have a feeling that since the 100th anniversary, you might have run out of breath a bit. I went, obviously, to Istanbul with the Armenians who were tracing the path of the first victims of the genocide across the Bosphorus. But after that, I said to myself, and I actually wrote, so what are you going to do on the 101st anniversary? And nobody wrote to me. You kind of, we got through the 100th. The Turks were relieved at that as well. But I want to know what you're doing on the 102nd and the 103rd and the 104th, because you haven't won yet the recognition of the genocide. You're doing very well, but you haven't won yet. But then again, I go through my files and I say, what's the British government done? Tony Blair tried to keep the Armenians away from the British Holocaust Day. Can you believe it? Look, here's under the Freedom of Information Act, British government, Foreign Office ministers being briefed by British civil servants. Here is one briefing. HMG, Her Majesty's government, is open to criticism in terms of the ethical dimension, but given the importance of our relations, political, strategic, and commercial, with Turkey, and that recognising the genocide would provide no practical benefit to the UK, or the few survivors of the killings still alive today, thank you very much, nor would it help a rapprochement between Armenia and Turkey, which we all want desperately, the current line is the only feasible option. Denial of historical truth is an option for the British Foreign Office, you see. Here are more documents I was sent by friends in London. This written by, dare I even pronounce his name, Michael Attenborough, International Affairs and Defence, published from the House of Commons Library as an indication to ministers as to whether they should acknowledge the genocide. It has proved extremely difficult to disentangle the truth, and the issues remain the subject of considerable controversy. This is a British Foreign Office civil servant. Observers are far from unanimous, and you know the ones who are not unanimous, don't you, as to whether the massacres and deaths that occurred during the deportations constitute an official campaign of genocide perpetrated by the Ottoman authorities. And then officially the government acknowledges the strength of feeling about what it describes as a terrible episode of history. You feel very strongly because 1.5 million Armenians were killed. And then recognizes the massacres as a tragedy, like Shakespeare or whatever. However, neither the current government nor previous British governments have judged that the evidence is sufficiently unequivocal, etc., etc., etc. God, and I have a British passport. Look at, don't get carried away. Here are the Australians. Back in 2015, an Australian minister dared to suggest that he thought, yes, it really was a genocide. In stepped Foreign Minister Bishop. While the government, she said to the Turks, was sympathetic to the Armenian people, oh, you have the sympathy as well, other communities that suffered such terrible losses during the tragic events, your tragedy again, at the end of the Ottoman Empire, the Australian government does not, however, recognise the events as genocide. The minister added, we do not seek to intervene in this sensitive historical debate. It's fairly sensitive, 1.5 million dead, isn't it? We believe the issue, now you've just become an issue rather than a mass murder, is best resolved through dialogue. No, it is best resolved through truth. And that's the catch, you see. I'm not going to mention any of your recent presidents and their constant lies that they will recognize the I still keep my little clipping. I cut this out of the New York Times when Obama made his, Armenian genocide is not an allegation, a personal opinion, widely documented fact. I cut this out because I knew he wouldn't say it. And your present president, let's not even mention him. But don't think that us journalists are innocent of these lies. In 2009, I was interviewed about the genocide on Canadian television, CTV. And I was stunned to hear the genocide described on CTV as deadly massacres. Think about that for a moment. Yeah, you got it, Miss. Deadly massacres. As opposed to undeadly massacres, where presumably they get up and go home afterwards. You see, the problem for CTV was this. On the picture behind the presenter was a big picture of dead Armenians taken in 1915, black and white picture. And obviously, 1.5 million dead is a bit bigger than a massacre, isn't it? So they invented a deadly massacre. And when I denounced this at a public lecture that night in Toronto, I got a nasty little SMS message from the presenter saying, you were way over the line, Mr. Fisk. Oh, I'm so sorry. Who do these people think they are? This is a denial of the genocide again. Now, let me go to the Irish Times, a wonderful paper in Dublin, left of centre, although, of course, it's nationalism is the bedrock and foundation of politics in Ireland. And this is Kevin Myers writing. Kevin Myers has since been thrown off the Sunday Times for writing what was alleged to be anti-Semitic remarks about two Jewish employees of the BBC. Now here is his, this is 11 years ago, but this is him talking about the Armenian Genocide. The Allies were simultaneously conniving with Ottoman Armenian separatists and the UK-French invasion of Turkey in April 1915, he's talking about Gallipoli, of course, triggered a convulsion of insanity. I'll start that again. Triggered a convulsion of insanity through an already neurotically insecure Anatolia. The Turks had a medical problem, you see, neuralgia. So it wasn't so bad. Hundreds of thousands, I'm quoting Kevin again, hundreds of thousands of Armenians were rounded up by their Kurdish and Turkish neighbors for translocation. I never heard the word translocation. You were translocated, so it wasn't too bad after all. Vast numbers were killed, etc., etc. And then he says, he's trying to say basically, forget the Armenian genocide, let's look to the future. But here's what he says, and you can tell from these weasel words, an absolutely incomprehensible sentence, what he was trying to do. Well, you won't really understand, but I'm going to read it to you. Modern politics is not about disinterring the past, but transmuting its legacy into the future through the prism of the present. What on earth is he talking about? That's how far journalists will go to deny the genocide. They will talk incomprehensibly and write incomprehensibly. And that's what you're facing, unfortunately. Now, Sarah, I'm going to need your wondrous machine working up here if you can. And the man or the lady on the lights. I'm going to talk to you about photographs because this is courtesy. I'm going to go to that mic over there, okay? Hello, hello. Yes, sir. Okay. Now, Victor Pitchman. How many of you know this sequence of 3 pictures I'm going to show you? Hands up, anyone who's seen this picture before? Okay, then you, 2, 3. What a miserable. Okay. Victor Pitchman, an Austrian soldier who had his little box camera. It was a YouTube at the time, you see. I got it. It was the YouTube. He had his little box camera. My dad took a box camera to the trenches of the First World War. We all had them, the Westerners, you see. And probably not entirely understanding what was happening, he caught this Armenian convoy coming from Erzurum. Now, did they know that they were about to die? Because everybody on that convoy died. They were all murdered, or raped, or had their throats cut. You can see, of course, it's a summer's day. We're probably talking about July 1915. Beautiful trees, and here they come with their belongings, pack animals, etc. Next picture, can you, Sarah? Now they're coming right through you. They're coming right towards you, these people now. Notice the women there with sticks. And over here, and you can see it better on the original print, piles of shoes. Don't these people look at these shoes and say, what happened? Why did people keep on walking through the desert without shoes? Or were they so destitute? Were they so broken that they didn't even realize they were walking on their bare feet? Last picture, please. And so he went on shooting. They actually pass you. They go through this room, and they're going to die. This young boy here. And you see, they've even got carts, animals to carry them. Here are the pile of shoes, and more shoes down here. And that, of course, is where the photographic record ends. But we need more pictures. There is said to be film taken by the Kurds, actual movie film, real film, not fake film, of dead Armenians lying on the Erzurum road. These are the pictures that, up at Yerevan, they're now discovering, for example, that photographs taken by the Germans of the genocide were taken by German officers back to Berlin in 1918. The Allies allowed them to go back to Berlin. And in 1945, when the Red Army tore into Hitler's Berlin and looted everything, they took some of the albums of photographs. And in Yerevan, they're finding pictures from the genocide in Moscow. And you've got to keep on finding these pictures and getting new movie film. Keep the genocide alive. Even if we have to make these people relive on screen before us their last journey. Thank you very much, Sarah. Can we put the lights up? So I'm going to give a miserable ending to my talk. Look. Here is a magazine produced by the Armenian government, but published in Europe. It's not the Times of London, of course. It's their take on Armenia. Ministers, foreign minister, all quoted in here. And not one of them mentions the genocide once. Even the Armenian government negates it in the interests of commerce. So what do? Keep going. Don't stop your campaign about the greatest war crime of the First World War, in which my own father was a soldier, and which a New Zealand soldier, who would then have been a British soldier, died defending your people. Make a list, maybe, of the good Turks, some people have, who saved Armenian lives, and ask Erdogan to sign it. Because if he refuses, he is acknowledging the genocide. And if he does sign it, he is acknowledging the genocide. Thank you for your patience, ladies and gentlemen.